For so long, I think we've debated the legalization of drugs as though it's a yes and no answer. Should we legalize drugs? No, in which case mass criminalization. Or should we legalize drugs? Yes, in which case mass commercialization. Maybe the crucial question now is not do we legalize drugs or not, but how would we legalize drugs? What would legalization look like?
Na een eeuw verbod keert het tij. Drugs worden steeds vaker gelegaliseerd. Maar volgens rechtsgeleerde Kojo Koram komt de echte vraag nu pas. Hoe richten we die legale markt in? En wie krijgt de macht?
And I think now's the time to think about that, because the decisions made today will hard code that market for the foreseeable future.
But we know we must do more because the drug cartels will do more. After all, there's a lot of money in this.
En dus kijken investeerders verlekkerd naar deze nieuwe markten. Maar Koram waarschuwt dat we de drugsmarkt niet zomaar volgens Amerikaanse kapitalistische principes moeten inrichten. Want de VS heeft de mondiale drugsaanpak al lang genoeg bepaald.
Countries from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and of course North America and Europe, all of them pushing the war on drugs, was actually something that was really enforced by American power. Hard power and soft power.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
So we're often told that it's for health reasons because of the potential addictive qualities of these substances, and that is something that was a concern, but there was also a huge concern around a racial panic, essentially, and particularly the dangers that these substances held towards a kind of purified idea of white America. And it's only really since the turn of the 20th century, since the emergence of the United States really as the hegemonic power within the international arena, that we've had this project of trying to globally prohibit the trade of particular drugs.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
This idea that drugs or certain types of drugs are just intrinsically dangerous to human beings, and that's why they've been prohibited. They've been criminalized, they've been punished, but all the drugs that have been prohibited, whether that's opium, whether that's cannabis, whether that's cocaine, have been used from human society since time immemorial. There's always been, controversy and, stigma that surrounds the use of psychoactive substances. But in the era of kind of European imperialism, this wasn't an obstacle towards these drugs being commercialized. We look at the way that the French Empire treated opium in the East Indies. We look at the way the Dutch treated cocaine in Java and Indonesia, and perhaps most famously, we look at the way the British treated opium in terms of the East Indies. And they saw these drugs as just another commodity to be commercialized for profit, to be produced and sold in the same way that coffee and tobacco and sugar were. The use and the sale of these drugs were seen as pretty familiar to everyday society. You'd go to the apothecary and you could buy, cocaine-flavored tooth drops. You could, use opium as a medicine. And it's only really with the kind of moral panic of the early 20th century that you start to get this campaign against vice at an international level, counter-narcotics programs that were funded by the United States, but also things like sanctioning countries or refusing to give aid to countries if they didn't comply with the United Nations Drug Convention. And so what we've seen over the last decade is people realizing that the promises of complying with that system aren't actually manifesting, and in fact having a lot of counterproductive results. And so the idea of the war on drugs was that we would have a drug-free world. Even the United Nations now still sees almost 300 million people in the world using prohibited drugs. Around 20% of all prisoners in the world are in prison because of drug offenses. That's almost 2.5 million people in the world for growing, using, or selling the wrong substance. And people could look at the impact it's had on addiction and death rates. all those statistics have been going up despite more and more money being spent on enforcement. So I think with that framework, you've started to get countries started to move away from that and experiment with new systems of either decriminalization or full-scale legal regulation. And what I think is really interesting is over the last decade or so, we've started to see the fragmentation of that system of prohibition and perhaps an emergence of a new era of commercialization of these same drugs.
Tax here, the tax structure.
Starting in 2012 with Washington and Colorado State legalizing the trade of cannabis recreationally, then followed by Uruguay, Canada, Germany, lots of different places. And so I do think that that's eroded some of the anchor of the former war on drugs model, but I also think part of the motivation behind the change in the US has also been economic. After 2008, when capital was looking for new inputs, it's always looking for new inputs through which to commodify and to grow, but particularly in a stagnating economy with austerity being imposed upon public services, the argument about commercializing cannabis started to become a lot more attractive. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that with some of the profits and some of the huge companies that's emerging in this field. Deloitte estimated that the legalization of cannabis has added over $76 billion to the Canadian market. And I think when you start seeing some of those figures, just 5 years after legalization, that is going to start more and more jurisdictions looking to take this type of step. I think anybody who has spent time working in, kind of drug treatment services, as I've done, is aware of, the damage and the risks that can come with drug use and the impact it can have on people's life. You look at the kind of ideas around drug dependency, and that is tied to, mental health, that's tied to your employment status, that's tied to security of housing, that's tied to personal feelings of alienation. And the idea that we can simply ban the drug and disappear the problem, I think has been shown to be false over the best part of a century. We're seeing dependencies around everything from social media to overeating, to shopping, to gambling. There is clearly something about the way we're living in the modern world that I think is leading to us all being as alienated, lonely, and isolated as possible. And that is the perfect terrain for those dynamics of dependency that we know as addiction to really start to emerge themselves. We're clearly in the midst of a mental health crisis all across the world. The WHO recently estimated that 1 billion people worldwide are currently living with some sort of mental health disorder. And within that framework, I think that has also been an encouragement for there to be greater clinical research, there to be kind of greater investment in looking at cutting-edge mental health treatment, including things like psychedelic-informed therapeutic practices. And so this is probably advanced furthest in Australia, which in 2023 legalized, psilocybin and MDMA for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. And even Donald Trump himself recently signing an executive order looking to fast-track psychedelic medicine within the United States.
And I just want to thank the people behind me are outstanding. Today I'm pleased to announce historic reforms to dramatically accelerate access to new medical research and treatments based on psychedelic drugs in many cases.
If you'd have said to people in the 1980s, you'd have a Republican president sitting in the Oval Office talking about how he wants to take psychedelics, I think people would have thought that maybe you were on psychedelics, but that is the reality of how fast things have changed over the past decade or so.
If these turn out to be as good as people are saying, it's going to have a tremendous impact on this country and other countries too.
And when you see those executive orders being signed, you can see figures from the industry around Donald Trump. You can see, your Joe Rogans and your Robert F. Kennedys too, but you can see figures who are ready to commercialize and profit from these changes. Do we want to just simply go into that model, or do we want to use this ending of the war on drugs as an opportunity to think, how might we shape an industry, how might we shape a market differently from that commodification? We are seeing this desire to produce new treatments that might be able to address some of these deep-rooted and clearly escalating mental health issues that so many people are wrestling with. But what I think is really important is the question of not just producing these potential medicines, but thinking about who can access them and who owns them. And this is the question around how we actually allow these licenses to be grown. Because if you look in places like Australia, or you look in places like some of the US states where there is access to psychedelic mental health treatment, it can be prohibitively expensive for the everyday person. And it also can be owned by very small, incredibly wealthy biotech companies who are investing in the research and owning the patents of the medicines that then are eventually produced and put on the market. Is there other ways that we can think about this that doesn't replicate the pharmaceutical model that we've struggled with in so many other parts of the economy? I think that's something that we need to think about and explore. So we're currently in a world in which the same act that can make you a billionaire in one place can lead to you being executed in another. And I think we need to take a moment to try and frame a world in which we ensure that we use this change to try and repair some of the damage that the war on drugs has done to so many people and so many communities around the world. So you might have a kind of state pharmacy-based model, as they have in Uruguay, where, the sale and distribution is really controlled by the state. You might have, the kind of private commercial model in the United States, where we're seeing now, Forbes magazine have already celebrated the first billionaire entirely from the legal cannabis market. We're looking at these massive corporations starting to emerge in that space, and we're seeing the consolidation of that space. Or you might even look at some of the social equity models that are maybe in some of the more progressive US states, where they do have a commercial model, but they've tried to use law to engineer control of that model to communities that were most devastated during the war on drugs. And so one of the most kind of significant examples for that might be New York State, where they have put a commitment towards trying to put most of the tax revenue to be spent in communities that were over-policed during the war on drugs, and ensuring that at least 50% of the licenses are in the hands of social equity applicants, which include people who were incarcerated or had family members incarcerated during the era of the war on drugs. And you might even look at the kind of non-commercial cooperative social club model that perhaps has been most long-standing in places like Catalonia, but it's also the way that the German government decided to try and implement cannabis legalization within their jurisdiction. So individuals don't own a private retail shop which sells to customers in the kind of commercial model. They look at a cooperative model that encourages people to learn how to kind of grow the plant, to understand the subtleties of the plant, and to have a community that could hold the risks and rewards of use as they continue down their particular model. This is, I think, the time to talk about how we use licensing laws, tax laws, export licenses to try and create an economy that isn't as extractive and exploitative as so many other economies that are in the world today. And we can look at, industries like sports betting and gambling to try and see how kind of habit-forming behaviors can be intensified and worsened by commercialization and the different ways, especially in our highly digitized, highly transactional modern world, where you can, bet on 5 different things from your phone. We're also moving into a world in which, you can, order your cannabis online, you can have it delivered to your door, you can get medical cannabis without ever having to see a doctor. All of these different highly kind of fluid mechanisms for consumption might encourage some of the harms that we often associate with these substances. And so that's why I think it's so important to take a moment and to think about criminalization has failed. How do we design a market that minimizes the risks whilst also not replicating the harms of the war on drugs?
it's kind of hard to even imagine that there's a different way than the default commercialization. Is that something that you notice, or?
Absolutely. This is the famous idea that, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And, I always wonder what the kind of, British cultural theorist Mark Fisher would think about the legalization of cannabis, where it does seem, particularly in North America, to have been kind of filtered through into this capitalist model, that there's no other way of imagining it. And, that comes with the commodification of legalization. Mm-hmm. The German scholar Katrina Pistor talks about how we put all of these different elements, whether it's land, whether it's data, whether it's ideas, through this process of commodification, where they become property, where now you can get collateral against them. Now you can get a license for them. And drugs are being put through the same process right now. They're becoming things that, you open your app, you can trade cannabis on ETFs on a trading app. You can see cannabis advertised on Instagram. I think if you'd have said to somebody, 25 years ago, that if you go to New York, if you go to, including London on the tube, if you go to all of these major cities, that you'd be more likely to see a cannabis advert than a tobacco advert, they'd have thought that you'd lost your mind. And so we've seen a drastic change in a very short period of time in a lot of different areas around our attitudes towards drugs. If we simply allow the market to simply take control of these substances, we might create new problems, new dangers, and I think that that's something that we're not thinking about enough at this moment. And once a lot of those regulations and a lot of those kind of industry norms have been crystallized and hard-coded, it's very, very hard to try and change them. I think rather than trying to change an industry once it's been baked in, we should try and take this opportunity right now to try and shape our ideas of how we move beyond the war on drugs in a way that doesn't replicate all of these harms that we see in all these other industries across our economy.